Eminences, Excellencies, Bishop Chancellor Sanchez-Orondo, President Zamagni, Senator Giannini, and distinguished colleagues. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences workshop on the COVID generation, children and youth in and after the pandemic, responding to the world crisis. Over the next 2 days, we shall share new data and conceptual work on the lives of children and youth under the wicked COVID-19 pandemic. We will hear from scholars, practitioners, faith leaders from around the world, present new and heretofore unpublished papers. We will reflect on the levers of change needed to respond to the pandemic qua children and youth in ways echoing the Bishop Chancellor's message that are humane, culturally relevant, data-informed, and scientifically sound. As we move forward, we shall endeavor to articulate the vehicles needed to prepare for the inevitable next pandemic. Under COVID-19, millions of children are experiencing damage and dislocations. COVID-19 can be described as a long-lasting catastrophic shock, removing youth and children from the prescribed pathways to reach and master culturally marked milestones in the maturational, socio-emotional, cognitive, and moral realms. Millions of youth, as President Zamagni just shared with us, are in mourning and facing losses that are at once tangible and immediate, as well as ambiguous and indefinite. In the extreme, millions of youth are losing parents and caretakers. The pandemic has also robbed many of the rituals and routines that structure and give predictability and meaning to daily life. The pandemic robbed millions of youth of learning opportunities, the joy of socializing with other youth, and the support from caretakers, teachers, mentors, faith workers, and extended family members. For millions, the pandemic disrupted access to school, healthcare, nutrition, sports, and various other scaffolds needed for normatively appropriate maturational development. According to a UNICEF study, quote, across virtually every key measure of childhood, progress has gone backward in the last 12 months. The pandemic at once revealed and intensified gross inequalities. Inequalities, of course, that flow, as the Holy Father has stated, from the dictatorship of money. Children have been robbed of opportunities to flourish and to develop. Some of the papers presented over the next 2 days will focus on disadvantaged youth who are experiencing alarming new levels of food insecurity, child abuse, child trafficking, and child labor. Millions of children are in COVID mourning. According to a recent study published in The Lancet, more than 5 million children have lost a parent or caregiver to COVID-19. An earlier Lancet study found that the countries most damaged by parental caretaker loss were all in the metaphoric global south: Peru, South Africa, Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia, among the most affected worldwide. In the high-income countries, underserved, minoritized population face severe risk. US data, which are ever updated, suggest that youth in minoritized populations continue to be ravaged by COVID-19 related parental and caretaker losses. Recent data suggests that for every one white American child orphan, approximately 2 Hispanic American children, 2.4 Black American children, and 4.5 Native American and Native Alaskan children were orphaned. As our various scholars will reflect in the papers today and tomorrow, as COVID advances globally, it is leaving in its wake an empire of malaise and psychosocial suffering. Distress is the pandemic within the pandemic. In a very rare advisory on youth mental health, the United States Surgeon General warned, quote, recent research covering 80,000 youth globally found that depressive and anxiety symptoms doubled during the pandemic, with 25% of youth experiencing depressive symptomatology and 20% experience anxiety symptoms. Negative emotions and behaviors such as impulsivity and irritability associated with conditions such as ADHD appear to have moderately increased. Early clinical data, I'm quoting from the Surgeon General, are concerning. In the early 2021 emergency department visits in the United States for suspected suicide attempts were up 51% for adolescent girls. Scholars, some in this room and some joining us today over Zoom, using a range of methodologies in various countries around the world, reveal significant increases in mood disorders, including depression and dysthymia, as well as anxiety, clinginess, distraction, irritability, panic, loneliness, and regressive behaviors, inter alia. While these are largely Western psychological and psychiatric categories, isomorphic, culturally relevant formations are emerging the world over. An analysis of 116 peer-reviewed articles with data covering a total of over 127,000 children and adolescents examined a range of primary data on COVID-19 related mental health impacts on children and adolescents. The researchers found more depressive and anxious symptomatology. These are panel data, limited of course, that compare with pre-pandemic estimates. The data suggests that older adolescents, girls, and children, adolescents living with neurodiversity and chronic physical conditions are most likely to experience negative mental health outcomes. The emerging comparative record echo a range of psychosocial sufferings. Studies from the United Kingdom, for example, show that more than a quarter of children aged 5 to 16 and young people aged 17 to 22 report continued disrupted sleep. 1 in 10 report often or always feeling lonely. Many were fearful to leave the house. Parents, compared with working age adults without children, experienced larger than average increases in mental distress during the pandemic. In a pattern repeated in a number of scholarly papers, youth with a parent in psychological distress were most likely to have probable negative mental health outcomes. Indeed, a plethora of studies deploying disparate methodologies with different conceptual frameworks are beginning to paint a global picture of the dangerous mental health undertows children and youth face as they struggle to navigate the global ebbs and flows of COVID-19. Isomorphic patterns of psychosocial suffering are emerging in empirical studies around the globe, including research from Argentina, Canada, China, India, Jordan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Qatar, Australia, Italy and Spain, Austria, Germany, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, Greece, Ireland, South Africa, and others. Poverty, violence, migration, and traffic in the age of COVID-19. COVID-19 has put millions of children on the streets and at risk of abuse, trafficking, and exploitation. Our colleague David Bloom and Madalena Barrana offered an early assessment of COVID's impact on children and youth as, quote, degrading the emotional and mental health and increasing the risk of domestic violence and abuse, end of quote. Abused children, niños desaparecidos, missing children, the children of forcibly displaced migrants, children in modern slavery are enduring in an empire of suffering that COVID-19 is making harder to survey, prevent, and heal. According to the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, quote, women, children, and migrants have been identified by survey and interview data as particularly vulnerable to recruitment and exploitation during COVID-19. Women and girls have been recruited, often locally or online, for sexual exploitation, especially in private apartments. Children have been particularly affected, out of school and needing to support parents who have lost their livelihoods. Children have increasingly been targeted by traffickers at the local level as well as online. They have been trafficked for sexual purposes, forced marriage, forced begging, and forced criminality. There is clear evidence, I continue to quote from the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, there is clear evidence of increased demand for child sexual exploitation materials, which has, during COVID, exacerbated the exploitation of children around the world, end of quote. COVID-19 has put millions of children at risk for diverse and complex reasons. First, research has shown that extreme poverty compromises socio-emotional and cognitive development, health and wellness in vulnerable populations. The COVID-19 pandemic is pushing an additional 97 million human beings into extreme poverty. Global hunger and malnutrition continue to cripple millions of children around the world. The COVID-19 pandemic is reversing important gains. Food prices are a near all-time high. And as of, quote, January of 2022, agricultural commodity prices, the index, is up 25%, higher than it was in January 2021. Maize and wheat prices are up 20% and 25%, respectively, higher than they were in 2021 levels. Millions are suffering from chronic hunger, regularly not getting enough to eat to conduct an active life. The pandemic, along with new drivers of mass migration, are pushing unprecedented levels of both legal and unauthorized migrations. Over the last 12 months, the most trafficked border in the world, the border between the United States and Mexico, has seen a skyrocketing surge of unauthorized immigrants with an all-time record of 1.7 million apprehensions. Quote, many of them fleeing pandemic-ravaged countries, trying to enter the United States in the last 12 months, capping a year of chaos at the United States southern border, end of quote. According to the International Organization for Migration, the vulnerability of international migrants are exacerbated, quote, with the COVID-19 pandemic. Migrants have been affected, I continue to quote, by the pandemic in a variety of ways. Many have lost their employment in destination countries and have been unable to return home. Many of them ended up in irregular status in destination countries. Others have been forced to stay in inadequate accommodations with limited COVID-19 safety measures in place. Families of migrants have suffered through the loss of much-needed remittances. Survey and interview respondents highlighted the plight, in particular, of migrant domestic workers who have been confined to private homes and exploited by abusive employees, end of quote. In the words of Mary Waters in this room, we are just beginning to sketch out the contours of the differential impact of the pandemic on immigrant families and children. Educational disruptions. For youth, the school is the home away from home. The pandemic stunned education systems with geologic force. United Nations data suggests that under COVID-19 probably has wiped out 20 years of gains as perhaps 100 million children or more fail basic reading skills because of COVID-19, end of quote. According to UNESCO, the most vulnerable children continue to face significant loss. Quote, since its outbreak 2 years ago, the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted education systems globally, affecting the most vulnerable learners the hardest. The costs stand to be tremendous in terms of learning losses, health, and well-being, and dropout patterns. Continue to quote, prioritizing education as a public good is crucial to avoid a generational catastrophe and drive a sustainable recovery. To be more resilient, equitable, and inclusive, education systems must transform, leveraging technology to benefit all learners and building on the innovations and partnerships catalyzed throughout the crisis, end of quote. The COVID-19 pandemic has renewed expectations that new technologies would be deployed to effectively continue the education of youth via remote teaching and learning. As Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching scholars have argued, quote, the COVID-19 pandemic saw schools the world over turn to digital technologies for continuing schooling of millions of children. This rapid innovation has led to great enthusiasm about the potential for network tools to provide more children with low-cost access to learning opportunities that might help minimize existing educational inequities. I continue to quote, ambitious initiatives to provide inexpensive computing power to those most in need have distributed network laptops to children in remote villages and urban centers in the hope that provision of access to content and modern tools would fuel learning. Although these experiments have yielded important insights, they largely fail to lead to significant transformational practice, end of quote. There are indeed causes for concern. Stanford Scholar of Education and Technology, Bridget Barron, notes, quote, over a third of youth worldwide do not have access to internet, and most of these youth are people in developing countries. End of quote. Indeed, significant gaps in preparation to leverage technology to connect homes and schools, and equal access to the internet and devices, and differential teacher preparation and parent knowledge have limited our capacity to sustain remote learning in these times of crisis. Other research suggests that new technologies can be powerful tools, but are also creating a whole set of new concerns in basic educational domains. Scholars have articulated concerns over the impact of the new technologies in long-term impact on reading. And here I refer you to the work of Marianne Wolf, a member of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. Concerns over socio-emotional development, cyberbullying, concerns that the new media undermine empathy, give children and youth access to inappropriate materials, and can be lethally effective new tools for the exploitation and trafficking of children and youth. Furthermore, the purposefully designed addictive features found in new media platforms open another serious domain of deep concern. The path to recovery and reconstruction. All human learning is relational and constructed, with more advanced learners scaffolding the socio-emotional and cognitive schemas, as well as the fonts of knowledge of more novice learners. Technologies that build on and enhance that fundamental feature of learning will prove beneficial. Technologies that are designed to bypass the human touch will likely prove to be fool's gold. As we move from emergency relief to recovery and reconstruction, we would be wise to heed the words of the Holy Father, who said, quote, "In order to educate, one has to be able to combine the language of the head with the language of the heart and the language of the hands," end of quote. In reconstruction and recovery, education must endeavor to inculcate in children cognitive skills for critical thinking, as well as metacognitive abilities to become lifelong learners, civic agents, and for making the transition to the labor market of the 21st century. But perhaps, above all, as the Bishop Chancellor has written, has just shared with us, and as Senator Giannini wrote in the beautiful book that we are shortly releasing, we must nurture the humane sensibilities, empathy and perspective-taking, communication and collaboration skills. The work of education is cultivating the science of healthy, flourishing, and engaged children and youth. In the Platonic tradition, education endeavors to nurture logic, that which is true, and science, ethics, goodness, and justice, and aesthetics, beauty. Creating a more inclusive, just, and sustainable world is education's most urgent challenge. In the words of Pope Francis, a summons to solidarity with the next generation, with each other, and with our ever more fragile planet, as the papers by Kathy and Jim Stone suggest, is the ethical imperative of our times. It is too soon to discern the long-term sequelae of the still raging pandemic, as Professor Caffo has indicated. Its long-term impact of children is yet to be known. Children are resilient and are highly adaptable even to the most adverse of circumstances. According to the US Surgeon General, quote, "More than 50 years of basic research suggest that increases in distress symptoms are common during disasters, but most people cope well and do not go on to develop mental health disorders. Many young people are able to bounce back from difficult experiences such as stress, adversity, and trauma. Youth are inherently resilient," end of quote. The sources of resilience are not always obvious. The answer does not lie in individual characteristics. Research, our own and that of others, suggests that the process plays out in a physical and social environment that involves family, caretakers most immediately, but also includes peers, schools, places of worship, and other institutions of society. Just as the pandemic, like war and flight, imply a disruption and destruction, healing comes with the rebuilding of the child's social world. Fortunately, we know how to do that. And it's primarily, we do it through the institutions of society. Schools will have a special role in reconstruction moving forward. The workshop, I believe, represents, to the best of my knowledge, one of the first international interdisciplinary and comparative efforts to examine the effects, the unfolding effects of COVID-19 on children, youth, and emerging adults, draw lessons learned from best practices, and develop concrete policy suggestions to prepare for reconstruction and for the next catastrophic disaster. Today and tomorrow, we shall examine new levers to make the family, schools, and the institutions of society tasked with promoting the healthy development of children more humane and equitable, more engaging and fulfilling, more relevant to the desperate needs of youth around the world. Therefore, we will turn to a variety of regional perspectives from the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Europe. Thank you very much.